Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the webinar. We're just going to give it about 3 or 4 minutes so more people can join us. Thank you. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started with introductions, and then people can still trickle in as we go. Welcome, everybody, to the third webinar in Positive Women's Network's HIV First Responder Series. This one is going to cover the topic of how to combat stigmatizing reporting whenever somebody has been criminalized because of their HIV status. Just a logistical note, folks who are joining us will start out muted, but if at any point you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A box or the chat box. And you can wait until the question and answer portion of the webinar, and I can also promote you to panelist at that point if you want to speak your question directly to our presenters today. Also, if you've missed any of the webinars that we had before this one, they're all available on the PWN USA website. And then the recording for this one will also be available after it ends, and I will send that out to everybody who is on the registered list. So just a quick note about why we are doing these first responder trainings, and I'm sure some of you have already sat through this introduction already, but basically we wanted to develop this as a companion series to ongoing policy and legislative advocacy work that our chapters and memberships are doing in their states to change, repeal, reform their HIV criminalization laws. So this series is about recognizing the dehumanization of people who are criminalized because of their status, recognizing the interlocking consequences of criminalization, including violence, economic injustice, community, family separation, and increased stigma, and an overall recognition for the need for direct intervention and support when somebody is criminalized. So these webinar series was developed to provide advocates with a broader range of skills to provide immediate, direct responses when somebody has been criminalized. And our last webinar in the series will be on navigating the criminal legal system, and it's going to be on February 22nd at the same time, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. There's a link to register there at the bottom, but you don't have to write that down right now. I will send this out after this webinar is over in a follow-up email, so be on the lookout for that. All right, and I'm going to introduce our presenters today. First off, we have Carrie Foote. She tested HIV positive in 1988 and is a sociology professor at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and she chairs the HIV Modernization Movement, Indiana. Our second presenter is Olivia G. Ford, a freelance writer and editor and was the past communications director here at PWN USA, and she has been engaged with HIV-related media since 2007. Our third presenter had a family emergency today, so we're not sure at this point whether she will be able to join us, but hopefully she will be able to pop on before we end. That's Kamaria Laffrey. She's a woman who has been living with HIV for 14 years. She is a Florida community organizer for the Sarah Project and one of PWN's policy fellows for 2017. All right, with that, I'll hand it over to you, Carrie.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. I'm going to get us started here. So I'm Carrie and I chair the HIV modernization movement, and my perspective on media responses and stigmatizing reporting is coming more from what we've just kind of learned on the ground as advocates working here on reform and responding to some stigmatized media reporting that we've had in our state when we have had folks who've been unjustly criminalized under our Indiana laws. So what are some examples of stigmatizing reporting in media about people living with HIV who've been criminalized? So here on this slide, I just have a few headlines to give just some brief examples of just the blatant stigmatized reporting that occurs. So, you know, judge to rule if bite of HIV positive man counts as bioterrorism. You know, the charge is murder, the weapon AIDS. A man charged with spit as a deadly weapon. Man charged with hiding his HIV. HIV predator served time for crime, but may be confined for life. So you could just kind of see just some of the word choices that they've used in these headlines are incredibly sensationalized. So what do we mean by sensationalized reporting? Basically, this is a style of reporting news to the public that involves the use of fear, anger, excitement, along with crude thrill that is often undertaken by the media in order to boost their viewership and ratings, and lastly, profits. So this happens quite often when it comes to reporting on experiences of people who've been criminalized and charged under different laws while living with HIV. So what I'm going to start off here with is an example of a friend of mine and what happened to him when he was arrested under some of Indiana laws. So next slide. And this will kind of, to illustrate a little bit of Travis's experience and how we responded on the ground, will give you a flavor of just, you know, what happens when somebody is arrested, how does the media often respond in very negative ways, and then what can we as advocates on the ground do to kind of lessen the harm of some of these very harmful media reports. So first and foremost, I want to point out that Travis gave me permission to share his story with all of you today. He has specifically said it's okay, and he wants people to learn, if he feels it can help others reduce stigma and help with the efforts of reform, that we're more than welcome to share his story. And I kind of preface that because it's really important to keep in mind that when these headlines come out and the news reports report on people who've been arrested under HIV criminal laws, they never gave their permission to have their HIV status put out there in the public and to be outed. So we as advocates need to be sensitive to, these are people living with HIV, and it's their right to decide who gets to know their HIV status, etc. And we should also be careful that we don't bring additional harm to them, even in our education process of talking about some of the harmful responses in the media. So in Indiana, we have several laws that criminalize HIV. We have your typical disclosure law. We have your typical making it illegal to donate, sale, or transfer semen or blood products while living with HIV. And then we have a couple of sentence enhancement laws for our battery by bodily fluid and our malicious mischief by bodily fluid that goes from a misdemeanor to a felony if you're living with HIV. So what I have here on a screen is a picture of Travis, and I have a headline of when a couple of headlines actually. So initially, an earlier headline was, man admits to hiding HIV status from sexual partners. And then when he was first sentenced he was charged under several charges, but one of his first charges, another headline read, Spore receives maximum allowed sentence for HIV scandal. Just think about that for a minute. Spore receives maximum allowed sentence for HIV scandal. maximum allowed sends this message that, wow, this is a very bad person. Sentence for HIV, scandal. Scandal implies something really malicious, malintent, some kind of harm was done there. And then ultimately, one of the most recent headlines, Indiana man sentenced to 3 years for not telling sexual partners his HIV status. But we don't really know much about Travis, do we? So one thing to point out when you're responding to media is that we are people first. We are people living with HIV. We have real lives. We experience things. So just a little bit about Travis. He tested positive in 2012. Adjusted fairly okay to his HIV status, but was never linked to care, never connected at all, never got a care coordinator, never saw an HIV specialist, just learned his HIV status and was sent on his way. Soon after that, within a year, he had a tragic farming accident where he lost his arm below the elbow. And it was after that that his mental health very much declined, dealing with severe depression, suicidal ideation. And it was very soon after that that suddenly he had disclosure charges filed against him, or non-disclosure charges. And then things really just spiraled out of control there, with the charges, the media kind of going on a witch hunt in terms of, if you've been with this man, please come forward. And more partners came forward and said, well, we didn't know he was HIV positive. So suddenly had a slew of charges against him. At the same time, he has several children, and throughout the time of being arrested, he lost visitation rights with his children. His ex-wife basically didn't want his children to have anything to do with him, etc. So that's just a little bit about Travis. So moving on to the next slide. On this slide, I'm showing what often happens when we have these media stories. You have your initial news story, and often every news channel will also have a Facebook page. And it's on Facebook where you suddenly get a whole nother picture of what happens in the media, where people start to comment on the news story. And unfortunately, when it comes to people charged under for HIV-related crimes, the comments are horrendous. They're full of incredibly stigmatizing language, very hateful, full of misunderstanding about HIV. Occasionally you get a gem in here where people understand that there's a problem with these laws and they understand HIV, but for the most part they're incredibly harmful. So for those of you who are on the phone, I'll just read a couple of these of just how brutal they can be. So one person writes, why was this Paz allowed a plea? Wow, he needs attempted murder charges brought against him. Death sounds even better. What a loser. Another person, he should have all his meds taken away and put in solitary confinement, and they should let the disease run its course. Another person, attempted murder should be the charges. And then another person, they need to put some kind of tattoo around their area or something. I heard about a guy also doing this for years. So these comments go on, and you have to kind of decide, do we do anything to these comments? Do we ignore them? They're out there. People are reading these. Often the family members of the person who's been criminalized are also reading these, friends, and it's just spreading gross misinformation about HIV. So next slide. So here's just an example of kind of what we did on the ground on how to respond to some of the media headlines as well as to some of the Facebook comments. So what we've come up here is with a template reply. So when somebody's criminalized and you get these awful comments in places like Facebook on news media reports, we've just come up with a template, very matter-of-fact, neutral kind of response to the comments that we post in the string of Facebook comments to kind of draw attention that there's a problem with HIV criminalization, that the media often doesn't have the facts, so often doesn't know much about HIV, and that these sensationalized reports can be very harmful. We share always a little bit about the latest science to educate people and provide a way to let them know, hey, this is a manageable illness now. You know, it's treated as a chronic illness. It's highly preventable, HIV, and we kind of share that in there. And then we kind of conclude in the end by providing resources for people so that they can learn more. And for us, we provide our website for our HIV modernization movement that provides information about the laws, how they can get involved, etc. One thing I made a mistake doing initially when we were deciding how to reply to these comments was I started replying to every single negative comment that was being posted. Without realizing that Facebook actually could have banned me from Facebook for doing that, because I would have been considered trolling people and using Facebook misappropriately. And somebody pointed out to me, you only need to post this once, and everybody who makes a comment on there can see your comment. And I just didn't realize that because I was inexperienced with social media. But we've just come up with this template response that I'm more than happy to share with people that they can modify for their own states, for their own purposes, however they see fit. So next slide. So another way we've used the media reports on Facebook when a news report comes out and you have the comments is, as advocates on the ground, we've used it as a way to try to connect with the person living with HIV's family members or friends who want to help their friend or family member but don't know how or don't even know where to begin. So we've come up with this very simple posts that we post in the comment section where I just say, if anyone is in contact with so-and-so's family or lawyer, please have them contact me, Dr. Carrie Foote. My email is foot@IUPUI, and I chair and I put our link for our HIV modernization movement. Now, most of the time we won't get a hit and nobody will reach out to us. But occasionally we get successful, and suddenly I will get an email from, in one person's experience, we got an email from this gentleman's mother, and she just said, I'm so-and-so's mom. I'm responding to your comment. So then I replied to her, and I shared a whole bunch of resources for her, and she just sent it brings tears to my eyes. She sent a very short email back, and she just said, you are a godsend. Now I understand my son is not a monster. And I never heard from her again, but just knowing that someone reached out to her and told her, you know, those headlines, don't believe the headlines, don't believe what they say. They're highly sensationalized. They're incredibly stigmatizing and harmful. There are people out here who care and understand what it means to be a victim of HIV criminalization. So this has been another way where we've just been able to use the media to our advantage to reach out and provide support to family members, and then sometimes to find out who the lawyers are of individuals so we can provide the lawyer's support, connect the lawyer to Lambda Legal, or connect them to the Center for HIV Law and Policy in New York, where they can provide expert advice to lawyers. Next slide. Okay, so this is an example of how we responded to an inaccurate, 100% inaccurate headline. So the headline about my friend Travis, it was after he was initially charged, I'll read it to you. It said, HIV positive man charged after spreading it to multiple women. So I'll emphasize, after spreading it. So what the headline implies is that he transmitted HIV to multiple women. So here was a case where it was a basic, you were factually incorrect about what happened with Travis. None of the women that he had relations with contracted HIV. So just right there, it was a basic, you've got the facts wrong. So what we did is we reached out to the reporter just to ask them, could you please make the headline at least accurate to what the charges were and what happened, because this was 100% inaccurate. And what I emphasize here is when you reach out to the reporters, it's often the reporters, they're not intending to be mean, they're not intending to be harmful, they just don't know. It's a poor choice of words, and they make errors and mistakes in reporting. So you want to reach out to them in a very supportive manner, just a very, would you please change this, and give them alternative suggestions. So that's what we did. We reached out and we just asked for a simple correction requested. It was an inaccurate headline. We pointed out some of the harms to the family of having an inaccurate headline like that, because they stay on the internet forever. They don't go away. And we just wrote in a very supportive, non-threatening way to the reporter, and we suggested they change the language, a simple correction to just change from spreading HIV to alleged non-disclosure of HIV, and tried to get them to change the headline. Now, we were not successful here, and I emailed them about 2 times, and then at that point, I went on and I stopped emailing them. So this headline is still out there. So we weren't successful, but I know in other states where people do try to reach out to reporters, often reporters are very responsive and will try to correct something that is factually incorrect. So I would encourage that, and when you do it, to do it in a very supportive manner and offer them alternatives that are accurate and then are also less stigmatizing. Next slide. So this is my last slide about Travis, and then we'll kind of transition on to some more tips and tricks and advice. These are 2 what I would describe as fairly good reporting on the topic of HIV criminalization in our state. So I'll just read the 2 titles of these headlines. One was, does Indiana need its duty to warn law on HIV? That sounds, hey, they're questioning the law. That sounds like a good thing. The other one is, do Indiana laws criminalize HIV positive Hoosers? Also another supportive headline, questioning the law. Are there problems with these laws? But when you actually read through the articles, the first one, does Indiana need its duty to warn law on HIV, makes another error that I think we need to be really careful as advocates on the ground. The article starts out being very supportive that we don't need these laws, they're outdated. But then they use my friend's Travis's experience as, but these cases are extreme, and this is a person who was intending to harm. You know, he was just being deceptive in what she wrote. She said this man was just being deceptive, and that's rare, very rare. But what she's doing is she's saying, while most people don't need to be criminalized, there's some people that still do need to be criminalized without knowing anything about Travis's experience and what's happening. So that's something also to be very careful, even with supportive reporting. There can be still sent this message that some people, and often it's the most marginalized among us, and Travis was one of those. He was never linked to care, never linked to care, dealing with unmet mental health needs. And those are the people we're often end up criminalizing. In the other article, which was done on our HIV Advocacy Day, do Indiana laws criminalize HIV positive Hoosers? The example I share on the slide here is quoting Travis's mother. So right there, we're pointing out this is a person. He has a mother, and she shares her experience and her testimony in the interview for the article, saying that her son is not a criminal. He lost his children. He lost his job. He lost his insurance. He lost his home, as she tells a crowd. So it's humanizing the person who has been a victim and showing, you know, this is a real human being that has a life. And then it goes on to talk about our HIV modernization movement, questioning the laws. So just that slide was just to kind of caution that even sometimes when you have supportive reporting, the reporter still can inadvertently send the message that some people still need to be criminalized. So with that, that's kind of all I have to share about Travis's story. We'll transition on. And Olivia, do you want to start this one?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's good to hear. Carrie, first of all, thank you so much for that presentation and for your work. And I think we're just going to go back and forth a little bit about this because I know that you've touched on some of these points already sort of started to show through Travis's example how a survivor's life can be impacted by this negative coverage. I mean, media is really the front on which, when we talk about people's lives really being ruined by these cases and by being criminalized because of their HIV status, media is really the front on which that can occur. You know, the stigmatizing headlines that Carrie referenced and that I'm sure you've all seen, the use of people's images, the breaking of their privacy, the violating of their privacy by having their HIV status revealed, and not only revealed just point blank, which already is a violation, but in this way that frames essentially their living with HIV as itself being a criminal concern, can lead to all kinds of negative consequences before a case has even begun in the lives of people living with HIV. And frankly, to impact a person's life in that way as a journalist is unethical and really goes against what is supposed to be a journalist's role, to seek and report truth and to themselves do no harm, which is something that we're going to come to in a little bit. But also, in addition, what's interesting about these stories, and is very common oftentimes, is that journalists will use police reports as their sole source for their stories. So first of all, that's an exceptionally narrow frame of the story, and it really positions, the person living with HIV as the villain, quote unquote, and whoever they've potentially connected with as a victim, and the kind of police and the law enforcement people who are sort of valiantly trying to protect public health as the heroes in that frame. But really what it does is reinforce this idea that, all of those ideas are stigmatizing, terrible, and untrue. And they also reinforce this idea that HIV is a criminal concern to be dealt with by law enforcement instead of when we know that, first of all, that just doesn't work, it doesn't help public health, and actually is detrimental to the health of the person, the health of all people living with HIV. To present stories in that way. But honestly, while these laws exist on the books and while people are being charged, journalists are in a position where they can think of it as a criminal concern. They can think of HIV as a criminal concern, and they may not even see themselves as reporting on a story that has any impact on public health. They may use some language of public health, call this number if you've had sexual relations with this person, but in reality, their reporting is not grounded in public health at all, because that's not where they've gotten their information from initially. So that's really a place where, again, as Carrie indicates, advocates can play a really powerful role in reaching out to those journalists and their editors. Oftentimes, the journalists themselves may not, they put that story out there, but they may need to go above their own heads in order to make changes to it, especially headlines, because oftentimes the journalist isn't even in control of what the headline says. Sometimes it gets tacked onto the story. You'll often see that stories may be reported, there may be problems, but they're reported fairly well, and the headline is just wildly sensationalized, because the editor thought, well, this is what's going to get clicks. But really reaching out to those editors and giving them that information that grounds them in the fact that this is a public health issue. And this is also, it's a human issue. This is, as again, Carrie said so beautifully, these are people's lives. And journalists are in a position to be allies and to help the effort of sort of furthering the lives and the dignity of people living with HIV and affected by HIV, or they can do this terrible harm, which they sometimes end up doing. So yeah, we can that's a couple of my points on this impact piece. Carrie, did you have anything else?
Yeah, so I'll just highlight a couple other bullets here that you haven't touched on. So one here is that it perpetuates stereotypes against HIV positive people, LGBTQ folks, and people of color communities. And one way, of course, HIV positive people, anybody charged under these, are often living with HIV. But the other two communities, because of course people living with HIV are very diverse, but it particularly perpetuates stereotypes against the more marginal and vulnerable communities among those living with HIV. And I'll just point out here, people of color communities, people with black and brown bodies are already criminalized by our criminal justice system. Then we also have people living with HIV, disproportionately, community of colors are impacted. So when it comes to the criminalization of people living with HIV, we also find that communities of color are often going to be disproportionately impacted by HIV criminalization. So what does that lead to? It often leads to that these stories in the media are often people of color who've been charged under these laws. So then the public sees this, and it just perpetuates this stereotype, that People who identify, as gay, bi, or trans are people, to be feared, to be dangerous, and people of color, because that's the images that are being shown in the media more often than not because of the disproportionate impact of these laws on the most vulnerable and marginal folks. Olivia, were you going to add to that?
Yeah. No, I'm so glad that you brought that up, and this is where the kind of back and forth can go. And of course, that image, if folks don't know, that's on the slide is of Michael Johnson. That's one of the, I believe that was one of the first headlines and pieces that circulated several years ago around his case. And one advocate, I think, described that case as, what is that, perfect storm of toxic masculinity, anti-Blackness, homophobia, really kind of astute way of putting it. But it really, I just want to piggyback on what Carrie was saying, that, these are essentially what media outlets are doing, or they're reinforcing in people's minds the idea that these people that we're showing are the people that you need to be afraid of. And it happens around other issues as well. There was and particularly around HIV criminalization, just as Carrie said, Black people, people of color, are disproportionately impacted by HIV and also disproportionately impacted by this coverage. There was a really, really kind of first of its kind study in Canadian media, really, really, really kind of like deep digging, exhaustive study of coverage of, and Canada, like here in the U.S., leads the world in criminalizing people for their HIV status. They've had a lot of really egregious cases. And the researchers were particularly looking at media over the past, I believe, 20, 25 years around criminalization cases. And what they found was that, people were, again, no one should be charged for living with a health condition, but that most people who were charged were actually white people. And, Canada is a predominantly white country, though it's not exclusively white, but that by far the vast majority of the coverage was about Black immigrant men specifically. And so I think it was like a high percentage of that coverage was about just 4 specific cases that happened to also be Black immigrant men. So they really were able to prove something that we talk about anecdotally quite a lot, which is that that the media images that are put out there around these cases are really kind of riding the coattails of existing biases in the culture around people living with HIV, around LGBTQ folks, and around Black people and people of color, people of immigrant experience. So that was a study coming out of our neighbors to the north that was reported on. The study itself was reported on last year, and I can share that link with folks if they're interested, if that helps in their media work. Anyway.
Right, and just to kind of, and then to build off of that, just these headlines in general promote gross misinformation about HIV. And reporters could use this as a way to actually educate the public. So the headline I have here for Michael is, on the slide, is college student accused of exposing partners to HIV, taping sex. In the general public's mind that is mostly uneducated about HIV, accused of exposing partners, they're going to, I am making an assumption here, but more than likely, they're going to treat that almost as if it's like the common cold. And HIV is that easily transmitted, when HIV is not easily transmitted at all. And the news reporter could have used the article to educate the public on this is not an easy virus to transmit, to share some of that science around HIV. But more often than not, the reporters don't do that. And more often than not, it's because the reporters themselves don't even have that basic HIV 101 education. But what these headlines do is they skew the truth about HIV, how it's transmitted, how easily it's transmitted, who transmits it. So going back to the stereotypes and what people who are criminalized tend to get the most reporting and coverage do tend to be the most vulnerable people. People of color, people who engage in sex work, people who inject drugs. And so then that also sends the message that these are the people to fear when it comes to HIV, when of course people living with HIV are a very diverse group of people, but the media sends the wrong message. And then the biggest message that is not sent is that most HIV is not transmitted by people who know their status. It's transmitted by people who do not know their status. And one of the other harms of this is that the media, when we look at the studies, while we find that the laws per se themselves, having an HIV specific law, may not deter HIV testing, the media impact can deter HIV testing. So the more media reporting about the laws, the more hesitant somebody may be to go and seek an HIV test to know about their HIV status. So we have a lot of different just different bullets on this slide. I think we kind of touched on most of them. But overall, these inaccurate headlines and reporting and very sensationalized reporting makes it really hard for public health workers to do their jobs because it's sending inaccurate messaging, and it just makes it harder for them to get their public health messages across and then to engage in what is shown to be best practices when it comes to HIV prevention, treatment, and care. And then overall, it increases stigma and discrimination, not just towards the person living with HIV. And it is very important to know these headlines don't go away. They stay permanently on the internet. They're going to be there, they're going to be out there. Anybody who does a search on that person's name, it's going to pop up. And that damage is lifelong and won't go away now that we have the internet. And that's really important to kind of keep in mind. So it's also important to kind of combat it, to get positive stories out there, that when people do those searches, they find the good stories along with the harmful stories that can be helpful and dispel myths and that sort of thing. And then the families are also harmed by these things because they're experiencing backlash as well. You know, what kind of person did you bring into this world? Look at this. We don't want to have anything to do with you. And the families are also incredibly harmed by this inaccurate media reporting, etc. So did you have anything, Olivia? Out of breath.
No, I know. No, that was great. And I think that we're going to come back to some of these points as well in some of the later slides too. But thank you so much for that, Carrie. I believe the next slide is mine. Can I get the next slide, please? Someone wants to move it along? If I'm able to. Okay, great. So what can we do? Which again, I mean, Carrie has given such fantastic examples of what advocates on the ground in Indiana have done around cases in their area. And of course, do no harm does not just apply to the law. It can kind of seem like an odd, obvious tip, the whole kind of first do no harm idea, because the purpose of advocacy really in any arena is to help and not harm. But, you know, as we've touched on, kind of HIV criminalization itself, as well as the way that we talk about it and the way that we message it, is complicated, it's nuanced, and it's really important to sort of be thoughtful about the ways that we talk about and respond to communications around HIV criminalization. And there are some ways that we as advocates can do as little harm as possible. And really strive to do no harm at all. So some points to keep in mind around this as you kind of launch your advocacy, your media advocacy work and your responses to these kinds of cases and this kind of coverage, is that further media visibility may not be warranted in the case. Something I believe Carrie also touched on is that sometimes these are open cases. These are cases that are currently in court, and there may be kind of barriers to the person speaking for themselves in the news or speaking to anyone in media about their case, and B, could potentially bias the case to have further coverage. The individual themselves may really just want the story to go away. So our first obligation is to the person who's been accused to make sure that their needs are being met, essentially. And again, Carrie gave some examples of how she's gotten in touch with the folks themselves, folks' families. That keeping in touch can be really important if you're doing kind of ongoing advocacy around a particular case. I'll get to this in a little bit, but it can be, but sometimes advocacy work is best kept behind the scenes, even in media. So, you know, it may not be, there may be a time, a strategic time for that, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, I just wanted to, I realized I can raise my hand. So I just wanted to, on the media visibility, I just wanted to comment there that, you know, also as advocates, our group kind of runs into a struggle on where sometimes it's just such awful reporting that we want to use these reports to advocate for reform. But sometimes it also involves, it's such awful reporting that by bringing it again to the, you know, to the forefront, it actually can also continue to cause harm to the individual, particularly when we find that a person may have been arrested for other things, whether it's drug use or sex work. By constantly bringing that up, not only are we re-stigmatizing them for the criminalization of HIV, but we're also in a way re-stigmatizing them for the criminalization of sex work or criminalization of drug use. And there's a fine line there, and it's a real struggle for us on how do you kind of balance that, especially when we don't know the individuals and we're not, you know, in touch with them. So it's just, we kind of encourage, be reflective, think before you act in terms of how you're using the media and inaccurate media reporting for your reform efforts moving forward, and to always think that these are real people. You know, we talk about them often as cases, but these are people, you know, living their lives and trying often to move on. And some of them, like Olivia just said, they just want it to go away. You know, when the charges are done and it's all over, it's never really done for them, but they don't want it in the media. Often the folks have small children who could be, you know, harmed, and they don't want it to be drawn attention and have secondary stigma occur to their children and that sort of thing. So that's all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Carrie. And furthermore, this is a point I want to make sure to make, is that when we come across these stories, one first kind of instinct to gather, you know, to kind of to get with like-minded people and kind of spread the word about this horrible coverage that's being that's in the media, is to sort of take the social media with that article, share it, and say, "Isn't this terrible?" And then everyone goes to it and clicks on it, and, you know, your friends and neighbors and people who you are allied with and sort of aligned with in your thinking may say, "Yes, this is terrible indeed. I'm going to share this and let people know how awful this coverage is." The problem with that, though, is that the on the side of the media house, let's sort of go behind the curtain and sort of imagine what's happening back there. They're saying, "Wow, this story is really popular with our readers. You know, like, let's put it on the front page of our website. You know, like, let's uplift this. This is an issue that we need to cover further." So basically, those clicks are contributing to the idea that these stories are popular and that they should continue to cover them in this way. So it's really important not to, and it's kind of counterintuitive because we want to spread the word about how harmful this coverage is. But I really want to stress that it's important not to contribute to amplifying a problematic story by kind of sharing it in that way. Another way could kind of do harm reduction around that kind of, you know, kind of sharing and amplifying the story while still, you know, kind of sharing in circles of advocates, is to copy the text, don't include the link, you know, and paste it into the body of an email. So that, again, we're not feeding more clicks and more kind of support and evidence that this is, you know, this is such a popular, important story to the media house. Clicks are what they want. That's probably why that sensationalized headline is on there, in addition to lack of information about HIV. So we don't want to give the idea that they should have to continue that practice. So yeah, so our kind of continuing to kind of advocate publicly in that way may not be strategically kind of a good idea at this point. It may, you know, whether for defense counsel reasons or for the reasons of the individual really wanting it to go away. I did want to make a note, because this comes up on occasion. It's really, really rare that there are cases where a person's HIV status is introduced into the story around an event that involves an actual crime, actual brutality, like rape. This is a really, really delicate concern. It can be extraordinarily triggering to other advocates who have, who support sexual assault survivors, who are themselves survivors, and there can be a desire to kind of not touch a story at all, or at least not go on record publicly as supporting someone who may be accused of a crime that we would certainly not, as advocates, support or say, though again, that's a whole other webinar talking about the way that sexual assault is prosecuted and talked about in the media. But there's still the possibility and, the kind of importance of doing that behind the scenes work with media to highlight the aspects of the story that may be inaccurate around HIV. That person still is innocent until proven guilty. They still don't deserve to have their privacy violated, their name and address printed. So I did want to just highlight that, not to think that those stories are ones that we, can't do anything about or wouldn't want to, because again, there's really kind of, frankly, no arena, and I think that this is kind of a discussion for people to have within their own groups, but I'm coming from the perspective of there is no appropriate criminalization of a person's HIV status, really in any case. So so there's really other kind of, there's space to do work even around cases where we may not necessarily be supporting the person, but we're kind of supporting accurate information about HIV to be disseminated through media. And of course, and Carrie touched on this really beautifully, offering supporting comments if we have to read them, especially on articles. I think social media is a little bit different because oftentimes the circle is a little bit smaller. You can see who's commenting. You have the opportunity of sort of connecting with them. Basically, the connections are a little bit, if not warm, then close than they are with comments on, just sort of general article comments. And it can really be, just as Carrie showed, and I'm sure everyone's seen, a real just vat of, just really a trough of horrible, stigmatizing comments. I would say don't feel obligated to read them. It's a really, really rocky road, but I think that, as Carrie said again, if you've, sort of come across them on the bottom of an article, sort of pasting in an actual, kind of factual article, pasting in kind of that kind of template language that Carrie used, can at least let someone else reading know that this is not, that these people's comments are not the only way of thinking about this issue. But again, I've had some folks sometimes say, like, well, what's our advocacy strategy around comments? Oh, I will say that they can, at the bottom of an article, when you choose to make contact with the journalist and the editor to make changes to the story and to the headline, if there are a lot of really negative comments gathering, oftentimes they can turn the comments off on that article. And you might consider asking them to do that on the basis that if this is an open case, those comments can, they're harmful to the individual, they're harmful to people living with HIV and affected by HIV, people's families, but they also could potentially bias a case. So unless the journalist really wants to go on record in writing saying that they support a person's case being negatively affected by the comments on their site, then hopefully they would turn them off. Again, people are not always successful, unfortunately. They may say, well, this is conversation, it's free speech, blah, blah, blah. But it's an ask that you can make as an advocate. So again, in terms of working behind the scenes, which I believe is the next slide. Am I able to advance my own slides? I'm a little confused. If somebody would, oh, there we go, great. So as again, Carrie mentioned, there's the opportunity to use this negative coverage as a teaching tool to reach out and, share the inaccuracies in the headlines and in the pieces themselves. And really, honestly, I want to reiterate that that information and science and truth are really on the side of HIV advocates in this case. And oftentimes journalists will be open to learning more and may not have, kind of come to these realizations about the realities of living with HIV today, and the realities of HIV treatment, care, and prevention today. So there's the opportunity to use that coverage with them as an opportunity, as a chance to point out specific points around which they can be educated or need to be. You can also frame this in terms of the overall problem of HIV stigma and lack of information without mentioning the specifics of the case or talking about the specifics of the case when you respond, or talking about, you know, the kind of motivations of the individual, or, you know, kind of singling them out. You can really, there's plenty of material to talk about the problem overall without having to kind of further rehash the details and the specifics of that person's, of what's being said about that individual person. Definitely important to keep in touch with those who are closest to the case. That's family members, that's the person themselves if you're in touch with them. That's their attorney if you're able, as advocates, if you're building a strategy, to be in touch with that person, just to make sure if you're, you know, if you're doing any kind of more public media work, that it's in line with sort of the needs of that case. We touched on this earlier, the idea of refraining from helping to amplify those problematic stories, really hold back from that sharing, and do not by any means, I mean, I'm sure they've been shared in media. Yes, it's true. The photo is out there. The person's name is out there. Don't use the photos or the names, and certainly not the addresses of people who are accused in your responses. We'll get in a little bit to sort of potential tools of response as community members, in terms of sort of making interventions into media yourselves. But please, people don't need their information to be spread further, and those violations to continue. With any, you know, with what we do as advocates and what we do as writers. And again, Carrie really did touch on that beautifully earlier. Next slide, please. So now messaging, getting that message right. And this really does, this is kind of part of that do no harm piece in a lot of ways as well. You know, it's as if you're kind of together as a group already, you're assembled like the HIV modernization movement in Indiana. You can talk beforehand, before there's kind of an emergency or a case comes up. What do we want to say about HIV criminalization, and how do we want to say it? You know, kind of what are our groups, kind of what are the messages that we want to advance about HIV criminalization? And that's going to change from audience to audience. I mean, some, you know, if you're talking to docs and public health workers, you know, and trying to sort of bring them on as allies, they may be more swayed by a public health message, whereas groups of people living with HIV and other kind of intersectional groups that you may want to kind of ally with and teach them about this issue may be more swayed by, you know, kind of human rights or even human interests, kind of anti-stigma messaging, and really talking about how this practice of HIV criminalization has really codified stigma. And we know that stigma is this key driver of the epidemic today. So, so really making, you know, making sure that the messages that you're using, you're kind of tailoring for who needs to hear certain aspects of what is essentially wrong with HIV criminalization, and really also making sure that the messages themselves aren't themselves reinforcing stigma. This happens, and again, I mean, I'm very heavily relying on Carrie's presentation. She mentioned this as well. You know, making sure that when we talk about HIV criminalization, you know, we as advocates have a lot of information about living with HIV today. We have a lot of information about the science, and we know that HIV is not easy to transmit. We know that if a person's on treatment, it's impossible for them to transmit HIV to their sexual partners. There is a tendency to sort of speak about individual people and individual cases in a way that suggests that there are people living with HIV who are deserving of punishment. You know, if we say, like, he was one of the good ones, he used the condom, he was one of the good ones because he had an undetectable viral load, that really sort of edges out an entire population of people living with HIV who for whatever reason are not able to achieve an undetectable viral load, are not on treatment for whatever reason, and really kind of ignores the nuance of questions of treatment and care and disclosure. So a way to talk about, I know that people get really, U equals U, which is the sort of idea or notion of undetectable equals untransmittable. I know that advocates oftentimes will use kind of the argument that people aren't able to transmit HIV if they have an undetectable viral load to, sort of talk about why these laws are outdated. And that's definitely true. It's really, I mean, the way that we can talk about that publicly is to say that the risk of HIV has changed radically. The fact that we now know so much about how HIV is transmitted, and that it's unlikely to be transmitted even in the absence of treatment. I think it's even with the most risky behavior that one can possibly engage in, it's kind of a 1 in 200 possibility of transmission. And even if and so that's if someone's on treatment. If they are, it's impossible for them to transmit HIV. So the risk of HIV has changed broadly. The harm of HIV has changed broadly. When transmission happens, what the person has is a condition that's treatable. It's a condition that they're able to get care for, and that's really different from when a lot of these laws were enacted. So we can talk more broadly about the fact about U equals U in the context of these really radical changes around HIV without saying you're good if you are on treatment and have an undetectable viral load, and if you're those people who are bad who don't are the ones who deserve punishment, because no one deserves punishment based on their HIV status. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little about that. Yes, Carrie.
So just to kind of piggyback on that, one thing when we're trying to educate reporters is to be sure that we're not just talking to them about the latest science, like U equals U, HIV is a chronic manageable illness, HIV is not easily transmitted, but to point out that the fundamental flaw in these laws is more really a criminal justice argument. They don't take into account a person's state of mind, whether they intended to do harm, whether any harm actually occurred, what is the nature of that harm that's occurred. And I think for us advocates on the ground, that argument's harder for us to communicate. We can talk about HIV because we live with it, but the criminal justice message, which is really the fundamental bottom line flaw with these laws, that argument to when you're kind of educating reporters to get that message out as well, because that will help inadvertently criminalizing the most vulnerable among us, those people who aren't in care, who are struggling with other multiple life challenges or oppressions in their life, that make them more vulnerable to criminalization. So when you're doing your messaging, remember with reporters, we have all kinds of education to give them. It's around the HIV science, but it's also around, the kind of criminal justice arguments on why these laws are problematic and damaging. And then if they can report that in their reporting, that can go a long way to also dispelling myths and also helping with the reform effort to, get more people to really understand why reform is needed for these laws. And quite often, I try, like my friend Travis, he was very detectable at the time of his charges. He was never linked to care. And, and he was charged with multiple charges. It's like he was charged once, he was out on bail, and then he was charged again after that. And they're thinking this guy is pure evil, when really what's going on is we have an individual who our system failed him. Why wasn't he ever linked to care? Why did that gap happen? And I try to also emphasize that to folks as well, to just don't assume motivations and what's going on. And the problem with the laws is they don't assess a person's state of mind at all. That's the fundamental criminal justice argument. So just important, when we are kind of educating reporters to become better versed at, some of these criminal justice reform arguments, to articulate that to them so they can report that in their reporting. And that will help, not sending the wrong message, like Olivia said, that there's still some people where it's okay to criminalize them, because that's what none of us want to do that.
Right, exactly. Thank you so much for that, Carrie. Yeah, basically in that legal argument, as Carrie said, that there are there's so many things that are wrong with these laws, and one of them is that they sort of violate these two legal principles. One, that intent to actually do harm must be proven, and two, that the kind of the punishment has to fit the injury that's been leveled. And again, we know that in so many of these cases, even when transmission happens, the injury is so wildly not compared to the punishment that's being suggested under these laws. So just in terms of that straight up kind of legal argument, and also that the burden of kind of proving intent is very low. There's this idea that if a person living with HIV has sex, that's intent to do harm. And part of our education around that is to show that that is absolutely false and that's absolutely untrue, and sort of gathering our evidence to show that. And as you said, absolutely, Carrie, that there are so many factors that affect a person's ability to access treatment, and that the system in which treatment is conferred is far from perfect, and it leaves a lot of people behind, and that the stigma that can keep people from accessing care is fed by these stories. So really, we don't need more stories demonizing people living with HIV. We really need none, because this, I mean, for so many reasons, not the least of which is that stigma is essentially the reason that we continue to have an HIV epidemic, that people are unable to conduct the lives that they want to conduct, essentially. I do want to make a point that everybody who's involved in your group does not have to be ready to speak to the media at all times. It's totally fine if people are not. It's really good to have a few people who are who have chosen to speak to media, who have been prepared to do that, and also that those folks are getting support from the group as a whole, because, you know, as we know, it's extraordinarily challenging to be a person who's kind of a face in media, especially if they're relating, you know, kind of their take on the story to their own individual experience, whether that's of living with HIV or of being the family member of a person living with HIV. So spokespeople really need to kind of have that community support as well, and really to be prepared for the rigors of speaking to media, really get to choose what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, the extent to which they're going to be vulnerable themselves. And again, just support for those folks as well. But again, I do want to reiterate that if someone, you know, if you're at a, you know, if you're, whether you're supporting a person who's been accused in court, or there's some kind of, you know, kind of public event or rally, or even someone reaches out to you in the community knowing that a piece like this is out there, and they say, oh, do you want to speak on the record about that? You know, as a person living with HIV or as an advocate, you can direct them to someone who's ready, if you are not one of those people. Next slide, please. And this connects to using our tools for response. One really powerful tool, and this is information that we sort of can amplify, is writing responses, you know, kind of through the community lens in kind of community grounded and community centered blogs, like TWN Speaks blog, for instance. A lot of the folks who are on this webinar have direct access to that outlet, to really kind of get practice and have an opportunity to share how this kind of coverage and how HIV criminalization in general impacts them, their lives, you, your lives, your communities. And it's an opportunity to kind of share those opinions, share those facts, and then share and amplify that piece, not the piece that you're responding to, the piece in which, the piece in which you are responding to negative coverage can be amplified, not the negative coverage itself. And once again, in those pieces, you don't necessarily, you don't have to and ought not use images or names of the person themselves if they have not agreed to it directly. Again, the fact that their picture or their name has been in media is not agreement by any means. And then again, if a story has been, kind of really heavily in the news, and you think, well, this is not going away, we really, I really want to address this in a more public way. I'm not hearing back from from these journalists to make changes to the individual pieces, you've got the tool of writing a letter to the editor. This is a tool that sort of it's time sensitive. Really, your window is about kind of a day or so after a piece is run, for you as a community member, you as an expert in that capacity, to write a letter to the editor of publication, pointing out what was not factual about the piece, again, without necessarily kind of uplifting the details of that specific case, but saying, a piece appeared yesterday in The Advocate, for instance, in which this, and this claim were made about HIV. I would like to set the record straight. This is actually, these are the realities of living with HIV today. These are the realities of access to care or lack thereof, of these laws, kind of bringing in potentially those legal principles, bringing in the idea, the stigma message, bringing in the public health message, whatever is going to respond to that coverage and also be compelling to the audience that you're trying to reach. Similarly, you can kind of if you've got spokespeople who have some grounding in the issue, they could be, whether they're, they work in the field, they may be case managers, maybe they're, if you've got a medical provider who's an ally, or a person who, a legal advisor of some kind. Again, if it's kind of warranted in this case, if you've made the decision to use this as a tool, use media as a tool, the opinion editorial can be a very powerful tool from someone who will be kind of immediately identifiable as, sort of grounded in the topic and knowing what they're, I put this in air quotes because I think that the way that expertise is framed can be a problem as well in media, but we can kind of use it to our advantage using spokespeople that we've chosen to highlight what's wrong with these, with this kind of coverage. And it can be really great to have, someone who works in public health who can say really strongly, these stories use this language that would suggest that that they're in the interest of protecting public health, when really the opposite is true. So that's a potential tool of response that can be in your toolkit when responding to kind of the issue and the sort of ongoing coverage around HIV criminalization. And I think that I won't go too deeply into this, but I think that Carrie covered it really well, around kind of using social media, around the comments, also around, that can be a place to potentially, if you've been, communicating with, with a publication to no avail. Again, this does not necessitate, sharing a link to the original story, but, we're concerned about, at the Advocate's coverage of an HIV-related story, we really need you to make these changes, and you can take to a platform like Twitter. You can make comments on their Facebook page, thoughtful, brief, grounded in facts. Again, the facts are really on your side. It's not at this point about public shaming. It's really about public knowledge and public information, and really encouraging media outlets to do their job in that regard. Let's see, do I have any more slides on this? Oh yeah, next slide. I think this will be my last one, or my last kind of formal one. This is kind of more about the long game, because I know that we're talking about first response, and we're talking about kind of immediate response to stories, and immediate response to, kind of show our support and respond to specific cases. But these can be opportunities, and hopefully can be, part of an ongoing kind of project of cultivating relationships with journalists, especially those who are covering HIV more thoughtfully, who are covering issues relating to HIV in a thoughtful way. You can reach out to folks who you think, maybe someone covers criminal justice in a really thoughtful, holistic, root cause rooted kind of way, and you want to reach out and say, hey, we really liked your story about juvenile justice or something like that, we're advocates who are fighting to end HIV criminalization. Here's a little bit of information. If you ever, sort of come across a case like this, we can be a resource to you. And if you are, as a group, are doing events, you can start to send those journalists your events and things. You may not hear back immediately, or you may hear back right away. I mean, journalists are really excited about learning more oftentimes, and reporting and doing their job well, kind of finding good stories. So you and your group can be a source of those stories. And it can be nice to start on a sunny day cultivating these relationships as opposed to when something's going down, so that when it's pouring and you need someone who, it's those really rainy days and it would be, you're thinking, wow, we really need to generate some positive coverage, not even around this person's specific case, but something that's going, something positive around HIV that really will have a kernel in it that refutes these notions around HIV criminalization. Oh, wow, we know some journalists who might be able to do that. You can kind of call on them, and they may be able to write the story in a way that you would want it to be told in the media. And that's all around kind of finding those champions who will do that in media, who will, and that's kind of like it's kind of like it's like a holy grail, really finding that person who you've cultivated, that journalist who gets this issue, who you can really say, listen, this is how we want this story to be covered, maybe in an ongoing campaign, can you do this? And, and know that it's likely that they're going to say yes, and that they're going to do a great job, and that they're going to consult accurate sources. They're going to consult community organizations. Are going to see the story in a more holistic way, and not just through the eye of the person kind of reading the police blotter and writing a thing about HIV, about a person who supposedly, allegedly did, hid their HIV status, and using all this terrible framing, and treating it as a criminal concern. Will really treat the story in a human way.
Okay.
Yeah, language matters. I can start it off, and then
okay.
And then we can ping pong. This is a really important one too. It goes back to talking about making sure that the words that we say and that we write about HIV and about criminalization do not further stigmatize communities living with or impacted by HIV. That is sort of at the level of the words, not even just the phrases that we use, but the individual kind of words and terms that we use. Language matters. Language can be a tool to empower. It can be a tool to further stigmatize. And these are a number of resources that exist sort of within and kind of concentrically with our community that contain some of that kind of problematic language that media can tend to repeat, and that we can sometimes even repeat, in our communities. That's really, really important to avoid in general as a practice, and particularly when we're talking to members of the media, because we are, you all are experts. They will, if they're talking to you, they're talking to you because of your expertise on this community's concerns, and will then kind of often model the language that you're using. So it's really, really important to model that language that promotes the agency and the dignity of people living with HIV and affected by HIV.
Yeah,
Carrie,
so
do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just real quickly add, tying into the previous slide with cultivating relationships with journalists. One thing I've learned is that, again, the journalists often are willing to learn, and they're often willing to improve things like the language and their, the word choices that they use when running stories that relate to people living with HIV, whether it's criminalization or something else. But I found now, anytime that I do an interview for a reporter, I always ask them, would it be okay to see what you're going to write about me before you actually write about it, so I can just correct, if you do get anything factually incorrect, and it also gives me an opportunity to address language. So there have been times where they'll use the term HIV infected, and I just say, please change it to people living with HIV. And I've never had any say, no, I'm not going to do that. They're more than welcome, like, oh, we get it, we see it. Thank you for pointing that out to me, because they don't want to contribute to the stigmatization of people living with HIV. So don't be shy to reach out to them and ask them to do corrections around language to improve and to destigmatize their writing. I found most of the time they're willing to make simple you know, as long as it's not a major substantive change, they're willing to easily go in, and all these stories are online now, and they can just do a quick change without having to go to their supervisor to get permission. And then the only other thing, particularly for those of you who are just on the phone, we have 3 resources here that are really good resources that relate to language matters. One is put out by the Positive Women's Network, which is actually a bigger guide on 5 things media makers can do to stand up to HIV stigma. Watching your language is one of them. Putting the living in people living with HIV is another. Talking to women living with HIV. There are facts and fictions, choose the facts, and write about disclosure as a complicated issue it is. And then the other 2 guides are strictly about language. So one is the GLAAD Media Reference Guide, which is about how do you do reporting that deals with LGBTQ plus communities, as well as people living with HIV, so that it's not stigmatizing. And then the other is the HIV Language Matters that Valerie, and I'm forgetting Valerie's last name right now, spearheaded, and I forget what group she's with, but it's a wonderful, simple guide on using preferred language to address stigma. And these are often things that you can actually share with reporters and say, hey, use this in your writing as you write up to improve your reporting when it comes to people living with HIV. So we did include links on that slide for those of you who might be interested in those. So that's all I have.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there are some cases, I am really glad to hear, and I've heard other people kind of report that, you know, have similar experiences to Carrie, where people are, you know, very willing to share what they've written before it goes live to make sure that they've got everything correct. They recognize that that their learning process may just be beginning, and they want to make sure that they're getting it right. Some journalists may be like, no, they may, and furthermore, it may go against their, you know, kind of the policies of the publication to share a piece when it's, you know, before it's gone live. So just in case as a stopgap, it is really important it's all the more important for this reason to share these guides beforehand, and also, of course, to stay on message when you're being interviewed. And I know that PWN, that's a whole other topic. I know PWN has done webinars and resources on, you know, values-based messaging and staying on message, and kind of really more about the nitty-gritty of speaking with media, which you're always welcome to reference on their website, of course. But that's why it's really important to say what you want to be printed, because there may be that opportunity to weigh in before it goes live, and there also may not. And then, as Carrie said, it is true that once the piece is already up, if you're looking at it and there's inaccuracies in it, I mean, in this kind of day and age of digital media, usually it's much less difficult to get them to make it, you know, it's not hard to get them to make a change once it's live. But if, you know, if we're talking about larger factual things, yeah, that kind of highlights the importance of staying on message, the importance of kind of sharing that language stuff in advance, and encourage, you know, kind of letting them know that it's important to use those guides, because you may not get the chance to read it. I am, you know, kind of very grounded in HIV specific media. I share people's quotes with them all the time, you know, as a writer and as an editor, and not all journalists do the same. They just, you know, and it's not, you know, they're not bad. I mean, they may just have different, you know, sort of guidelines of their publications, and sort of different practices. So just as a step, just to make sure to have those things in place as well in advance.
I think we covered everything. I don't have anything. We have a quote on this slide that just says, research has shown that if used effectively, the media can play an important role in lessening fear and stigma about HIV, the biggest obstacles to seeking information and treatment about the disease. So, you know, media can really be your friend and be your ally, and it is important to, you know, cultivate them to that advantage.
Okay, I want to thank Carrie and Olivia and Kamaria, who unfortunately couldn't join us but did contribute to the materials and the planning around this webinar. I'm going to open it up to all of you for questions. So just to recap, you can raise your hand and then I can unmute you. You can type your question directly into the chat box. And if you're calling in by phone, I believe you can just unmute yourself and give your question directly. So I'll pause and if you typed in a question earlier in the chat box, if you could type it in again so it jumps to the front, that'd be great. I had a question from Janika about the reverse effects of Marketing 101 and its effects using visual imagery. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that question, Janika? I can also unmute you if you want to ask the question directly. Okay, you should be able to talk if you wanted to give your question directly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
What I mean by that, like circuiting market, certain markets or marketing techniques are used to target certain populations in regards to how they use marketing for cigarettes, how they use marketing imagery for tobacco, alcohol, and just consumer products, and how to advance consumerism and things like that. And sometimes when we use our visual and that marketing technique, it can be negatively impacted the community, such as how to positively use that marketing technique. And what I was reading this book called Brainwash, and how they use those certain things to target certain populations or get certain products out on the market and just target that certain part of your brain. I'm not for sure how that works, but it's some kind of marketing 101 technique and a psychology 101 that they use when they're using those techniques. If you get what I'm understanding.
So is the question kind of like how to apply those techniques around in coverage on HIV criminalization?
Yes, but I
or
think
basically kind of like, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, but I think you covered it on the question that I asked, but you can go ahead to speak to what you were getting ready to say. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I took away from the question, and tell me if I'm kind of interpreting it wrong, is basically like if we can't use images, because Karen and I are both talking about not using images from people who are accused, then how can we kind of exploit this, like use to our advantage, like visual culture, basically? That's a really, really good question, because I really do want to stress that it's not about using any images at all, really just not images of the people who are unjustly having their identities, their HIV status shared in the media. Because media are using that tactic also. They're using that tactic to say, this is a criminal. This is what a criminal looks like. Be afraid of people who look like this. So it's really important. So they've got that in hand. So how can we kind of use that visual piece to our advantage? I'll share an example, and this is actually a very good one in terms of using people's, kind of using the images of people who have been accused, because by the time we did this was around the Michael Johnson case. The case, his image had been in media both without his consent and also by, sort of shared via journalists who had spoken to him, who had gotten his, who had, gotten his permission to use them, and were using, kind of images of him in his life. He has a child that he's essentially adopted and is a father figure too. So him like playing with his child, him like being, just living his life, because he's a person who has a life that's been taken away because now he's going to be in jail for the next, I know that he took a plea recently, and I think it's time served, plus maybe he's going to be in jail for 6 more years for something, for having a health condition. But I know that folks were raising money for his case, and it was really powerful to use a picture of him and his mom on for the hook of Mother's Day, and using a letter from her, which again was used with her permission and written by her, saying, this is my youngest child. This is going to be the 4th, Mother's Day that I've been apart from him. We were raising money for kind of really high legal fees. So, the idea was, with your help, maybe this will be the last Mother's Day that I have to be apart from him. So the image was, was of him and his mom, was of him, being a person's child, which is what he is, being a son. So there are ways to, and again, I mean, it's not in every case that it's appropriate to use a person's image. And there are many cases in which people really, again, and always want these stories to go away, don't want their image to be kind of shared in this way. But, folks had gotten the permission from Michael, they had gotten permission from his mom. And I think that was pretty powerful. Does that help at all?
Yes,
as an example, does. I mean,
yes,
there could also, I mean, if the story is more broadly about, you know, if you're doing some of that work to kind of refute stories without addressing the stories directly, and you're interviewing people living with HIV, you know, you can use images. I mean, if they're spokespeople and they've agreed, images of them living their lives, you know, it's the idea of kind of more broadly, you know, kind of advancing and sharing these realities of living with HIV today, beyond just what's covered in this criminalization coverage that's so stigmatizing and terrible. So there's certainly opportunity to use visuals. You know, if you're, you know, involved in a campaign and you're having like a public rally and you want journalists to come, let them know that there's going to be, you know, stuff to photograph. There's going to be posters. There's going to be, you know, spokespeople who have, you know, who have agreed to having their photo be used. So there's definitely opportunity. I'm glad you brought that up, because I know we were like, no photos, and we didn't really talk about times when you can use them.
No, but and I appreciate that, because, you know, a lot of people, like you say, that imagery, because once you put it on the internet, it's there and it's there for life. There is no trying to take it down or anything. You can have it taken down, but somebody's always going to find a way to put that back up. So how do we, you know, combat that part right there? I know it's kind of hard to explain this part, because I'm still learning how to connect the words and so forth. But I think that negative imagery of how they dehumanize people living with HIV, that's my biggest concern about that, them dehumanizing people living with HIV. It's life circumstances, things happen, and when you're not linked to care after a diagnosis, or, you know, when you're diagnosed, things can happen. Like, people don't know that they're, you know, transmitting it purposely. It's a small case of people that may do that, but that's not the majority of people living with HIV. A lot of people don't know they have HIV until they get linked to care or they get tested for HIV.
I also think with the visuals, you can also use visuals of those of us who are working on reform, who are openly living with HIV. So just showing other people in the media who are open about their status and don't mind having their picture shown, who are working on the movement, it humanizes all of us. You know,
Right.
so that's also another strategy where you can use the visuals when you are advocating for reform. You know, ask, you know, the reporter or whoever might be doing the story, you know, would you like to take our picture? You know, take our picture with our flyer, you know, and, you know, show real people living with HIV. It may not be the person who was criminalized.
Right.
Another thing, like with my friend Travis, his mother was very open. So I know that, and she was open to being, you know, to having her picture taken. So having his mom in the media also kind of just, it humanizes you, and people reading that, they see that you're more than just HIV. This is a real, you know, living human being. And then they become more, well, let me learn more. So that's another way you can use visuals.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you. Thank you both, Carrie and Olivia. Thank you both for answering that.
Thank you for your question. It was a great one.
Were there any other questions from folks? You can go ahead and raise your hand or type into the chat box. Well, in case you do have questions at any time after, we do have the contact info for the presenters, and this will all be sent out to you after this webinar is over. Also included will be the recording and evaluations for the session, and I really would appreciate it if everybody filled those out. So let us know, you know, where your takeaways are, how we can improve these webinars in the future. And please do save the date for the last webinar in our series, which is more geared toward navigating the criminal legal justice system. That's going to be February 26th, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. Registration links will be sent out to all of you. And it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I will close this out with thank you for attending, and thank you to our presenters. If you have any closing thoughts, feel free. If not, have a great rest of your day.
So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, really grateful to be here. Thank you so much.
All right.